On the afternoon of March 29, 1857, the parade ground at Barrackpore in eastern India was on edge. A young private named Mangal Pandey was pacing violently in front of the guardroom, armed with a loaded musket, intoxicated by the narcotic bhang, and threatening to shoot the first European officer he saw. That officer turned out to be Lieutenant Ba. He galloped onto the field on horseback, drew his pistol, and fired at Pandey. He missed. Pandey retaliated, bringing down the horse with a musket shot, before closing in and slashing Ba with a heavy Indian sword. Yet the true mystery of this standoff lies with the audience. Dozens of heavily armed Indian soldiers from Pandey's 34th Regiment stood mere feet away, and they did nothing. They just watched. When another Indian soldier, Sheikh Paltu, jumped in to save the bleeding British officer and begged his comrades for help, the crowd actually turned on him. They threw stones, hurled their shoes, and threatened to shoot Paltu if he didn't let Pandey go. This was a complete collapse of military order. The British East India Company relied entirely on these native troops to enforce its rule over the subcontinent. So why did the men of the Bengal Army suddenly decide to stand by and let their commanders bleed? By the 1850s, the East India Company's grip was maintained by the Bengal Army. This force was made up largely of native Indian troops, known as Sepoys, taking orders from British officers. For decades, the company had slowly chipped away at the economic and social privileges of these men, turning a prestigious military career into a life of second-class citizenship. Then, in the year 1856, the British annexed the princely state of Oudh. They claimed the native Nawab was misgoverning the territory and simply wiped the independent state off the political map. A massive portion of the Bengal Army was recruited directly from Oudh. Before the annexation, these soldiers held the special right to petition the British resident for justice in local disputes, a massive advantage in native courts. Overnight, the company erased that perk. By stripping these soldiers of their legal standing and their homeland, the company had effectively turned its own primary enforcement tool into its greatest internal threat. Deep resentment had taken root across the ranks. At the exact same time, cultural anxiety was peaking. Some zealous British officers had started distributing translated copies of the Bible, convincing many Sepoys that the company planned to force them to convert to Christianity. Then, the company introduced a new piece of hardware to the ranks, the Enfield P-53 rifle. Rumors quickly spread through the barracks that the new paper cartridges issued for these rifles were greased with animal fat, specifically fat from cows and pigs. Because of how the weapon was loaded, a soldier had to physically bite the end off the cartridge before pouring the gunpowder down the barrel. Consuming beef fat is deeply offensive to Hindus, who revere the cow, and pork fat is strictly forbidden for Muslims, which brings us back to the standoff at Barrackpore. While pacing the parade ground, Pandey was shouting at the watching soldiers that biting these cartridges would turn them all into infidels. The paralysis only broke when Major General John Hersey rode onto the field. He drew his pistol and threatened to shoot the first man who disobeyed him. Realizing the mutiny had failed, Pandey turned his musket on himself and pulled the trigger with his toe, but he survived the blast. For the soldiers watching, the cartridge represented a weaponized tool of forced conversion. Standing by as Pandey attacked their officers functioned as a collective silent endorsement of his outrage. Pandey recovered in the regimental hospital, only to face a court-martial less than a week later. On April 8, 1857, he was executed by hanging, alongside the native officer who had refused to arrest him. The British government then turned its sights on the bystanders. As a harsh collective punishment for failing to assist their officers, the entire 34th Regiment was disbanded in disgrace. But stripping the uniforms from an entire regiment didn't restore order. Instead, news of Pandey's execution and the harsh collective punishment spread rapidly to other military outposts. This map shows the rapid geographic spread of the uprisings over the following months. Starting from the Bengal region, isolated frustrations quickly cascaded into the massive, coordinated conflict known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857. By publicly humiliating the silent spectators, the British government inadvertently confirmed the soldiers' worst suspicions, pushing thousands of wavering troops to take up arms against the empire. The scale of the following rebellion required the direct intervention of the British military. proving that a private merchant corporation could no longer maintain the basic security or administrative functions required to rule the subcontinent. The British Parliament passed the Government of India Act of 1858, which formally dissolved the company and transferred absolute power directly to the British Crown, establishing the British Raj. During the fighting, British soldiers began using Pandey as a widespread derogatory term for any native soldier who had turned against them. Yet history remembers him very differently. Today in India, he is revered as a martyr and recognized as one of the earliest vanguards of the Indian nationalist movement. Mangal Pandey's isolated, chaotic act of violence changed the trajectory of the century. It didn't succeed through careful coordination, but because it finally provided a catalyst for a silent, heavily armed majority to act.